So good evening, class. Before we continue going over the provisions of PAS 1, I'd like to bring to your attention that I have shared a file to you in our Canvas accounts which shows an illustration of a complete set of financial statements. But of course, it is only for an in-existing corporation. The purpose of the file is only to give you an idea of how the financial statements will look like and how the required disclosures will be presented in the notes to the financial statements. Now, if you go over all the pages in the file I have shared to you, class, it would definitely cause a lot of confusion on your part, especially that you are still not very familiar with the requirements in the presentation of your financial statements. But as what I've told you before, I actually prefer you to get confused because once your confusion gets resolved, your understanding of the concept will be a lot deeper and then be very easy for the information to stick in your minds. Now, I do not suggest that you read the illustrative financial statement from page 1 down to the very last page. At this point, I just want you to search for the pages that actually contain the financial statements themselves, excluding the notes to the financial statements, and just get an idea, get an impression on how the financial statements should look like. Now, this is how I want you to approach the file I have given you, class. What you can see here is the illustrative financial statement for our consolidated statement of profit or loss. So, the two columns that you would see here are the expected money columns that should be presented in the financial statements, because aside from presenting the figures for the current year, you are expected to present comparative information. That requirement is actually also stated in PAS 1. Now, for you to be able to appreciate the file I have shared to you, class, you'll see some notations at the far right side of the financial statements, class, and it will actually bring to your attention the specific provision in the standard that is taken into account and would serve as an explanation and why these items are presented in the manner in which they are being presented. Now you can see here that IAS, again, the IAS is the international equivalent of our Philippine Accounting Standards. IAS stands for International Accounting Standards. So you can see here, IAS 1.51, that means it refers to paragraph 51 of PAS 1, particularly subparagraph D and E. If you'll notice, class, a lot of the markings pertain to PAS 1, and that is again understandable because again, PAS 1 governs the presentation of your financial statements. Here you can see PAS 1, paragraph 103, paragraph 99, so on and so forth. But if we go over the other parts of the financial statement, you can actually see that it also invokes other standards such as IFRS 5 or the International Financial Reporting Standard number 5, which governs your non-current assets held for sale and your discontinued operations. But at this point, that should not be your concern. So if you have time, you go to these particular provisions in the standard, class, and then you try to match, you try to reconcile why is this particular paragraph in the standard being identified as a relevant provision in this particular line item of the financial statements. So you can see that very dominant here are provisions from PAS 1, but we also have citation from PFRS 7 and PAS 8, which will be our topic afterwards. And in the file I have given you, class, at the end of every illustrative financial statements, there would be a brief discussion on why certain provisions of the standard are relevant. So, aside from visiting the specific provisions being identified in the illustration, it would also help deepen your understanding if you try to read the commentaries. Now, what makes the file very voluminous, class, is the discussion on the notes to the financial statements. So, if you remember, almost everything else that is required to be disclosed that are not yet disclosed in the other financial statements are to be disclosed in the notes to the financial statements, class. So around 80% or more of the file, class, is devoted to the discussion on the required disclosures that will be presented in the notes to the financial statements. but actual financial statements will not be as lengthy as the file class. This particular file is actually just very long because it presents an example on how certain information will be disclosed for various scenarios. Now, in the actual financial statements, if a certain disclosure is not applicable to you, then definitely it should not be part of your financial statements. The illustrative notes that is contained in the file I have shared class tries to illustrate all the possible ways in which the requirements provided by the standards would be disclosed in the notes. And as a result, the file ends up having a lot of pages. As to the portion discussing the notes class, you can actually just browse through them. Our focus now, because again, we want you to have an idea on how to present the financial statements, but the intricate details class would be discussed in your future accounting subjects. Our ultimate goal here is to just achieve a broad perspective on the various requirements provided by all the standards that comprise your financial reporting standards. Now again, as I've mentioned, for you to have a deeper appreciation of the provisions in the standard class, I want you to visit the specific provisions identified in the illustration and try to understand why is this particular provision being highlighted in this particular part of the financial statements. And also try to go over the commentaries provided in the document. Now, I'll give you an illustration class on what I expect you to do with the file I have shared to you. My favorite class would be PAS 1, paragraph 51 class. In your basic accounting, it's always repeated class that when you prepare your financial statements, you should not forget the heading, which should contain the company name, which should contain the name of the financial statement, which should contain the identity or the name of the financial statement, the period covered or the date in which the financial statements are prepared. You'd also notice, if you had opportunity before to look at actual financial statements, you'd always see that the financial statements would indicate that the amounts presented are in thousands, that the amounts presented are in millions. And you are always advised, class, to never forget the peso sign. But in the illustration I am showing right now, it's using euro. But the point is, we know those requirements because we were repetitively told of those requirements. But I find it interesting that those small details, class, are actually also contained in the standard, including the manner in which the amounts presented are being rounded off, whether it is in thousands, millions, or in billions, and the constant presentation of the currency that is used in the financial statements. Although that might be very easy to miss because most of the times we only encounter the peso sign. But if we actually go to paragraph 51 of PAS 1 class, the rules inculcated upon us by our basic accounting teachers are actually a result of a compliance to the provisions in the standard. If we go to paragraph 51 of PAS 1 class, paragraph 49 and onwards discusses on the identification of your financial statements. So going to paragraph 51, it tells us that an entity shall clearly identify each financial statements and the notes. So from this class, the constant reminder that you should never forget the heading of your financial statements is actually done pursuant to a requirement in the standard. Actually, if we also read paragraph 49 class, it also tells us that an entity shall clearly identify the financial statements and distinguish them from other information in the same published document. If we try to go over the other portions of paragraph 51 class, paragraph 51 provides that in addition, an entity shall display the following information prominently and repeat it when necessary for the information presented to be understandable. And that's why the enumeration provided in paragraph 51 class will keep on recurring on all the financial statements. Not just in the statement of financial position, it will also be presented or disclosed in your income statement, your statement of cash flows, and your statement of changes in equity. If we try to go over class, letter A, the name of the reporting entity, this will be part of the heading. We know this one not because we were introduced to the standard already, class, but because it has always been emphasized when you were still learning basic accounting. Letter B, whether the financial statements are of an individual entity or a group of entities, whether it is a separate financial statement or a combined or consolidated financial statement. The file I have given you gives you an illustration of a consolidated financial statement. Letter C, the date of the end of the reporting period or the period covered by the financial statements and the notes. So again, basically A, B, and C would be contained in the heading of the financial statements. Now for letter D and letter E class, this will now explain why financial statements would state that the amounts are in thousands or in millions and the amounts are in Philippine peso. Because basically, those items comply with the requirement in paragraph 51, subparagraph D and E. If your presentation currency is the Philippine peso, you have to constantly disclose that the amounts presented are in Philippine peso. That if you do not present the entire amounts, then you must present the level of rounding. Level of rounding meaning whether the amounts are presented in thousands, in millions, or in billions. So the items provided in paragraph 51 class are actually instilled on us already without us knowing that those things are actually in compliance with the requirement of a standard. When you learn basic accounting class, you were not introduced to specific provisions of the standard. You were just told to follow instructions without us knowing that the instructions are actually contained in the standards. So that's what I want you to do for the rest of the highlighted provisions in the illustrative financial statements I have given you, class. Visit the actual provision in the standard and try to understand why is that provision highlighted or emphasized for the particular line in the financial statement.